I want to thank you all for coming to this tonight. I know that it's the middle of dead week, so probably hard to get away from classes and also just hard to walk outside in general. But you are all here, and it is important that you are here. My name is Sean McQuillan. I'm the Vice President of the Associated Students of the University of Montana. Most of you look like students, so I'm hoping that you all know what ASUM is, but if you don't, we are the student government. We represent 14,000 students here at the University of Montana. A lot of our students are very interested in this debate that's happening on campus right now, and I'm glad to see a lot of you out there. One of the things that the organizing committee asked me to do was explain a little bit about what divestment was, in case there was anybody in the audience who didn't know. And as I was looking into it, I realized that I didn't understand 100% what divestment was either. I thought it was a person or an organization that was selling off their assets in, the stock market from anything that dealt with fossil fuels like coal and natural gas or oil refining. But one of the examples that I found on the internet, I think from Yahoo Answers, so don't judge me too hard on this, was if a person had a retirement account that had stock in Buffalo Wild Wings and that person was a vegetarian, if they sold their stock in Buffalo Wild Wings, that would also be divesting. So I thought that showed how wide of a range divestment can have. And then the official definition, which I will admit for the people here from Reinvest Montana, I stole this straight out of the triple bottom line packet. Divestment is the selling of assets that do not adhere to the social, ethical, or environmental standards of the investor, whether that's a person or a corporation. This panel tonight, as you are all probably aware, is designed to be neutral and purely based on educating our campus community as we sort through this big question of what is divestment and if it should happen here at UM. There will be time for questions from the audience at the end, and so we hope that you will pipe up and ask the hard questions so that we can really figure out what issues are remaining here to talk about. As most of you all know, if you're students, faculty, or staff at UM, the only thing anything gets done around here is with a lot of conversations followed by a lot of committees. And so it's very important that you guys are here having this conversation because this is moving the question of divestment forward on our campus, and depending on how many years it takes to get your degree, you might see it happen. So ASUM has heard a lot about divestment over the last year. A lot of students have come to us. These grad students that set up the panel came to us, and we always want to hear from students about issues that you have. But that is my opening. I think I covered it all. And once again, thanks for coming out and taking time out of your week to be here.
All right, thank you, Sean. Thank you all again for attending tonight's panel. My name is Steve Schwartz. I'm the professor and chair of the Department of Communication Studies here at the university, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel. My own research and teaching interests are in the realm of environmental communication and advocacy, and currently I'm working with colleagues on a book. One of the chapters in the book, in fact, examines the rhetoric surrounding divestment, and so this topic both has a personal interest as well as a scholarly interest for me. The event tonight has been organized by graduate students in Robin Saha's Local Solutions to Climate Change course, which is out of the Environmental Studies program. And I'd like us to acknowledge their hard work in making it happen. Those students are Stephanie Lackey, Nicola Preston, Jamie Russo, and Dov Weinman. So if we could just give a hand to them. And then I'd also like to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise and time with us, and I'll introduce them in just a minute. In working with the organizers and thinking about this topic and reflecting on several of the courses that I teach, I was very much convinced that this particular event should try to focus as much as we can on factual questions. What is it that we know and don't know about divestment, about climate change, about markets, about fossil fuel industries, about regulation, about moral reasoning, about university funding, and about pathways and obstacles to change. It's a staple of public speaking and argumentation courses that before you can really address a question of policy, a question of what ought to be done, you need to kind of get straight on your questions of fact. What is it that we know and don't know about the topic that we're addressing? It's often easy to just jump right to the what do we got to do without taking stock of what we know about the topic and figuring out what is it that we don't know and how we might figure that out. And especially on a topic that is as complex and as layered as divestment, I think it can be useful for us to suspend our judgment for just a bit about what ought to be done and devote some time to becoming better informed about divestment and its complexities. So that's really our goal tonight. I'm sure we'll hear opinions about what are the best options for us and what are the best things to do. But fundamentally, that kind of debate about action is especially helpful at this moment in time for helping us, again, figure out what is it that we know and don't know. What are the core issues surrounding divestment? And what else is it that we need to know before moving forward? All right, Sean's already stole my what is divestment definition, so I got to cut that out. I'm not. There's too much for me to address about investments. Why we bring in other panelists who can give you more on that. But there are a couple of items I think that are important to think about and understand about divestment from my perspective. One is that divestment as a practice that we've seen over history is typically one part of a larger campaign to raise public awareness about the practices of a particular industry or sector. It typically uses economic leverage in order to elevate non-economic concerns. And so there's always an interesting interplay between economics and other kinds of issues that are elevated through divestment campaigns. At UM in particular, divestment has emerged as an issue largely just in the past year, and largely because of student concerns about the impacts of fossil fuels, and particularly the challenge of climate change. The policy issue that it tends to point toward is whether or not the UM Foundation, which is separate from the university itself, should divest from fossil fuels and reinvest a portion of that money in regional and sustainable businesses. If the reinvest people want to challenge me on that, you can, but that's how I boil it down. There's two other things that I think are relevant to our discussion before we move into the talking about the panelists. First of all, it seems to me that divestment as a movement kind of beyond UM from a global perspective is primarily motivated by a study that came out a few years ago by the Carbon Tracker Initiative. And basically what that study showed, I mean, they analyzed company documents and international reports and crunched the numbers to come up with what Bill McKibben, a climate and divestment activist, has called global warming's terrifying new math. The basic bottom line of that is that the known fossil fuel reserves are 5 times the amount that can be burned and still stay within the 2-degree global warming limit that's generally been agreed upon as sort of the consensus red line, the line we don't want to pass without creating its particularly dire consequences for the planet and people. And even that number looks to be like we're pretty much on track to breaching it in the near future. So that's I think is one of the key motivating features behind the divestment movement is that study. And the second thing that is interesting to me as someone who studies this as a communication rhetoric issue is that one of the big arguments around divestment is that it is a merely symbolic issue. You hear that from a variety of perspectives to suggest that it's merely a symbolic means that the money that would be divested will simply be, those stocks will be purchased up by someone else. And so the doesn't really have a lot of impact. It's not real because it's symbolic, right? That's the kind of stuff that makes a communication person, that makes a hair stand up on my neck, right? And we say it's merely a symbolic issue. Yes, it is merely a symbolic issue. But guess what? Symbols matter, right? The very fact that we can fill a room with people to talk about this issue shows that divestment, as a merely symbolic issue, has real effects in the world. It's motivating conversations that may not have taken place before. It is reaching audiences that may not have been familiar with or dialed into some of the issues that divestment activists are interested in raising. So I'm sure we'll have some further conversation about that, but that's kind of one perspective that I bring as a communication scholar, is that to say that it's merely a symbolic issue is not to downplay it, but to me is to point very directly at one of the most important material consequences of divestment, is that in fact it starts to raise public awareness and generate public discussion about how we deal with one of the most fundamental issues of our time. And I think we can, that's a possible point of common ground regardless of wherever one's position is on divestment. So hopefully through some informed dialogue tonight, you can learn a little bit more about divestment and participate in some informed conversation as our campus moves forward. So here's how things will go. I have primed these panelists with questions ahead of time. Right? And we'll start out the panel. I'm going to pose a question to each of them that gets to some of their interests and expertise, and I think will allow them to make some opening remarks. Then I've got a few follow-up questions that hopefully will be essentially toss-up questions. There may be some conversation back and forth between the panelists. And during those toss-up questions, the organizers are going to come around with pieces of paper for you to write down questions on. Okay? So we're going to have a moderated Q&A period. They will collect those questions. And here's the deal. If you want to put your, it's like a quiz. If you want to put your name on it, that's cool. And I may, if I pick your question then at the end, I may ask for you to follow up on it or say a little bit more about where your question is coming from. If you want to ask a question anonymously, that's okay too. Okay? So our Q&A period will be somewhat moderated, but also some opportunities for participation if you would like to have a little bit of development of your question. Okay? It's not really democracy. This is how it's going to work. Okay. All right. Very well. So on to the introductions. Well, I'll start with Peggy. Peggy Kaur, at the far end of the table, serves as the Vice President for Integrated Communications. And in that capacity, she is responsible for internal and external communications with the public, including the news media, marketing, and other outreach efforts. She often serves as the spokesperson for the university, although not for the Foundation, which is, again, a separate entity from the university. And that's an important distinction to make as we move into kind of the complexities of addressing divestment at She's a alum, having received her undergraduate degrees in French and in journalism. Her graduate degree from Gonzaga University is in organizational leadership. After a career in the news media, she joined the University of Kansas as the Knight Chair on the Press, Leadership, and Community, and she came to in 2007 to serve as Dean of the Journalism School before taking her current position. Dr. Dane Scott is the director of the Mansfield Ethics and Public Affairs program and associate professor of ethics in the College of Forestry and Conservation. Dane teaches a course every fall titled Climate Change Ethics and Policy, and his research focuses on ethical issues arising from emerging technologies to address social and environmental problems. As an example, he just recently completed a 4-year National Science Foundation grant with Christopher Preston and Laura Jung on ethics and climate engineering. And then Dr. Sarah Rinfrey is an assistant professor of political science here at where she teaches courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels on regulatory policy, environmental policy, public administration, and American politics. Her expertise is primarily in the areas of U.S. environmental policy and regulation, specifically agency decision-making. And in this context, she brings familiarity with the EPA's proposed climate change regulations. So with those introductions, then, we'll start off with a few questions for our panelists, and I will start with Dane and then go to Peggy and Sarah. So the first question we pose for Dane to address is, what are the relevant moral considerations for divestment at UM?
Okay, so he starts with me. So I got on this panel by getting an email that I failed to respond to, and I was feeling guilty about it. And then Casey over here, who was a student in my climate change ethics and policy course a few years ago, comes into my office, and I couldn't say no. So I had to learn something about divestment. My class, I did have him. It was great. It was a teachable moment, if you would. So hopefully I'm learning something. But I did have my class write an argument. We divided the class in half. Half the class argued for divestment, and the other half argued against divestment. And then today we had a debate. And so everything I said, saying today, I learned from my students, right? Today. No, I'm just kidding, actually. But it was an interesting exercise. It was really good. And so while I was a little reluctant, I am glad that Casey invited me to do this. So I'm hoping to learn something. So I am thinking, you know, my only qualification for this, I've been for about 5 years teaching a course on ethics and policy dealing with climate change, and so we've been reading a lot of things. We haven't really read much on divestment as an issue because I think it's been more of a recent movement. In some ways, I think it's a good, you know, I like the idea that it exists because I do think power politics, where a strong activist movement is going to be necessary. I think there's tremendous vested interest in something like, you know, like some sort of a strong movement. Kind of has to occur in some way. But here are my thoughts about divestment. So on the one hand, I think the university absolutely has to invest in doing something about climate change. And I think it has. I think the university has done a lot of things. I was involved with, you know, a bunch of professors in this room working on a climate change studies program. And that is one investment. I think the university pays part of my salary to teach this course on climate change ethics and policy. And I think the university needs to invest more, right? Because this is one of the great issues of our time. But I think really the question, the way I understand it, you could correct me, is the question is, should UM join the divestment campaign as it's sort of being initiated by 350.org? So I think that's kind of a different question, right? That's a much different question. And when I started thinking about this and in the way I framed it, I think what they're doing is moralizing the issue of divestment or investment in the fossil fuel industry. So there's a couple of senses that you can use the notion of moralizing, or you're moralizing an issue. I think one's positive. So if you take something that might be framed as an economic issue like slavery, and then you moralize it, you turn it into a moral issue. So I think abolition, to me, was a very positive example of moralizing an issue. A sort of negative example is where it's sort of you're looking down your nose or tiresome going on. Might be when you moralize an issue in that sense, and it's kind of like temperance, where it didn't, wasn't necessarily a positive sort of movement in the end, and then it was repealed, right, after a time. So there's a couple of senses of moralizing. One is a very positive sense, and one is sort of a not very positive sense of the word moralizing. But I think that's the way I interpreted this sort of movement, as moralizing the issue of investing in fossil fuels. So the question is, should UM join that particular campaign? The other thing that jumped out at me is it seemed as though the way I understood in reading like some Bill McKibben, some other articles on divestment, is it kind of poisons the well in a sense. In the sense that if you don't join the campaign, what you're doing is not really the moral thing. And so there's a sense that it's sort of there's a bit of a trap. The notion of poisoning in the well was a medieval notion where you took a cadaver and threw it in the well so no one could drink from it, right? So it's in a sense you can't drink of the non-divestment position to some degree. So there was a sense of that. I'm not saying that it's guilty of that completely, but I felt that troubled me a little bit. So when I think about climate change, I look at it on the national level. What do we need to get done in terms of climate change? And I think on the national level, we need to get some legislation done. We need political action. right? And we're stuck in stalemate because of polarization. We need some sort of political action to make carbon expensive, the emission of carbon, and to make low carbon or non-carbon not expensive, right? And I think on an international level, we need to make it for countries like India, where you have like 800 million or more people living before the poverty level, a way to develop that is a low carbon pathway, where they don't have to rely on the loads of fossil fuel, dirty fossil fuel, dirty coal that they have, right? So the question is, toward those two goals, right, does this particular campaign that sort of moralizes investment in the fossil fuel industry, does it, help, right? Is it a positive sort of, is it the right kind of strategy, right? I think it's a good, well-meaning campaign, but is it a good strategy to help those two goals? Well, I think in thinking about it, I think on one level, if you were looking at the ways it could positively help, is I think it engages, it has engaged thousands of college students. And I think that's got to be a positive, right? Because they're going to take that with them. And I think it, on the other hand, it can raise public awareness. This has appeared in all kinds of national publications, right? The divestment campaign. It could, put it on the agenda, right? And I think one of the explicit goals that has been stated by Bill McKibben is to sort of make the sort of fossil fuel vested interest, the sort of lobbying campaign, sort of pariahs, by sort of moralizing this issue and maybe matching power in the sense of the influence that they have politically. On the negative side, it could actually increase polarization, and this has been mentioned because it divides it into an us against them sort of an issue. Either you're on this side or against this side, and if you're not for divestment, or if you're engaged in the fossil fuel industry, you could really be alienated, right? And you could be pushed away and lead to further polarization and obstacles to the legislation that we need. It could, for example, if it was successful, reduce research into carbon sequestration of coal, which, if possible, and there has been some cases where it has been possible, that kind of technology could be very helpful, especially in developing countries like India and China, or not China isn't developing, but relying heavily on coal. If that technology was less expensive and usable, that could be a very positive thing. And it could increase the use of nuclear power. Marta Sen wrote an essay in the New Republic recently that would basically argue we shouldn't just focus on climate change. It needed to be placed within sort of a larger energy spectrum, that if we reduce fossil fuels, for example, he's very worried that India is pushing too quickly, too hard toward nuclear energy. And so there's that side effect that could happen. And one of the things in terms of climate change is that I worry about is geoengineering. I've been researching geoengineering, and it's a crazy idea. And I think some of the rhetoric that I hear in the divestment campaign, this sort of alarmist rhetoric that we're heading toward catastrophe, and the focus on fossil fuels, if the catastrophic language with this complex issue of moving the sort of our civilization off of fossil fuel, if people take that seriously and things don't get going, that could gain momentum for these climate engineering initiatives, which I find troublesome. So that's in a nutshell. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dan. And their question for Peggy that we posed was, how and where does divestment fit into the university's values and mission, and how and where might divestment not fit?
Okay, thank you, Steve. And I want to add my words of gratitude to the students who put this together. It's working with a lot of moving parts when you put on an event like this, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone coming out, because as we approach the end of the semester, it's one of those crazy busy times for a lot of students and faculty and folks across this campus. I also want to point out that I am not here as truly a spokesperson for the president on this. He has been speaking about it himself, and nor am I speaking for the foundation, so I find that I am your generalist here. I often am asked to represent the university so I am in that regard representing the President's office, and I am looking forward to taking a few notes and being able to take some of the key thoughts back to him, because this is an issue in which I think he has been fairly deeply engaged. So my question I was asked was, where does divestment fit into our values and mission as a university? And I would say, and then where does it not fit? And I truly, personally, can't come up with an example of where it does not fit. I think it fits fully within the university. The discussion of divestment fits fully within the university's mission, the core values, the kinds of things we talk about, and who we are. I mean, as a university, I always say that we are a universe of fields of study, researchers, people who do professional and creative kind of work, people who do service, students, education. We offer a universe here, which is particularly special, I believe, about the University of Montana here in Missoula. We have at least and probably more than 174 different areas of study on our campus. I mean, that's remarkable, and newer ones coming up every day, the climate studies program that Dane mentioned, for instance. So we very much, I think, embrace complex issues. That's part of what education is all about. You know, we can wrestle with the easy ones, but where it gets fun and where the learning happens is when we wrestle with the complex ones. And this one is so multifaceted. I'm not sure if we tried to list all the complexities, we'd be able to do it in an evening. So it's a great topic. The mission of the university is very long, so I always have to look at it, but really it's about education. It's about, as the mission says, developing educated and humane and informed citizens of the world. That's one of the big outcomes that we're all looking for. When we talk about the university, and you see some of the university's documents, there are 4 core values that have been developed over time, and I thought I would just list those 4 values. If I can get them alphabetically, you may have to help me out. Diversity is one of the 4 core values for the University of Montana. Engagement is another one. Leadership and sustainability. It's an interesting array of core values that we have and that we try to live by. And some people would say we're far from meeting those in many ways. Some of them would say they are aspirational. We want to live them and we want to aspire to be better in those areas. If you take, I'm going to leave diversity till the end, but I see the whole discussion about divestment as fitting fully into questions about engagement and engaged student body, engagement of students who are putting together this panel tonight, engagements of students in the Reinvest Montana program. We have a very engaged student and faculty body here on this campus, and it actually is one of the things that is relatively unique about the University of Montana compared with universities nationally. We have a higher degree of this going on when they've measured our activities against other universities, most recently 2 to 3 years ago. So engagement, absolutely. Leadership, seems to me leadership and engagement go hand in hand. You can be showing leadership through a group activity. I also believe in the leadership of one. I mean, we can all be leaders in how we choose to live our lives and where we choose to put our time and our energy and our work. Sustainability, well, we have, there's a lot of talk about that. We as a university several years ago set a very ambitious, very aggressive goal for ourselves as an institution for what we wanted to achieve to be sustainable here. And we measure ourselves against it, and we have a ways to go. This conversation very much fits in with that. Now I'm going to circle back to that first one I mentioned, diversity. And when I think about diversity, I want to think about race and ethnicity, because it often is not the kind of diversity that we wind up talking about. And I'm not sure, is there a link there or is there not? I do look at this as a university that espouses diversity, tries to live the values of diversity, and we are a university, as we know, that is founded and lives here on traditional native Salish lands. So we have a number of programs, and we pride ourselves on on the kinds of things we are paying attention to and what we're trying to study and learn about. We do, as the University of Montana, have a higher diversity in terms of numbers of Native American students, in terms of numbers of international students, and in terms of numbers of veterans who are coming as students here, and students who are self-declared as students with disabilities. So we are actually, compared with other campuses in the state of Montana, considered diverse. At the same time, we know we have a ways to go, and I think for this topic, we're really talking about diversity of view, diversity of background. Do we have diversity of age, politics? Are you coming from an urban part of the world, very rural part of the world, male, female? I mean, we're embracing diversity in all its measures. And so for this topic, I just wanted to put in that little plug about diversity and all the ways we do look at it, and some of the ways I think we need to continue to look at it. I think the discussion about divestment also very much fits in with where the university is right now, because we do have a president who appreciates this issue and has engaged with students on this issue. I know he's had a number of conversations. I know he has valued those conversations. I have heard after those conversations how impressed he's been with the level of discussion, the level of dialogue, the amount of research, the amount of work, and the seriousness of intent. And he has not taken that lightly. And I think we're fortunate to have someone who is leading this university who will take the time to think deeply about these issues. He has spoken publicly about these to news media and to others. He has talked with the University of Montana Foundation, and I think as an organization, I know they also have taken this discussion very seriously. They have actively discussed it among their board of trustees, and I don't think it's an issue that's going away. And I think from what I have heard, and not secondhand, but firsthand from people in all these areas, that they welcome and encourage that discussion. I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you, Peggy. And then our question for Sarah was, what are the likely statewide political, regulatory, and social impacts that are connected to the issue of divestment at UM?
Thanks. So, politics, everyone likes to talk about politics, right? So, you know, I'm the person on the plane that they say, you know, what do you do for a living? I'm a political science professor, and the conversation usually ends. So, but with that said, politics is really important, especially for this conversation tonight. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also I'm going to talk about, too, why the EPA is really important, and some of the research that I've done on the EPA and how it's important for this conversation and kind of coming up with solutions. So what I'm going to discuss is looking at politics in terms of not us versus them, because typically when we talk about environmental policy in the U.S., it's us versus them, industry versus the radical environmentalists. But I think really what we need to keep in mind is that that mentality is detrimental. And I'll talk some about why that's detrimental at the federal level and lessons that we can learn from agencies and moving forward and students. So just looking at the political impact first more broadly nationally, so we all know that Congress really isn't doing anything unless, you know, they're fighting, right? So, but where does that come from? And divestment is really embedded within the climate change conversation. And so with climate change, so in the U.S., policy gridlock, and so it happens over time, and they just can't compromise. And so the discourse around climate change in the U.S. is that, you know, it's a job killer, it stymies business, and so it's detrimental. And so that's one of the concerns. And so we really haven't had any major environmental policy legislation since the 1990s Clean Air Act reauthorizations. There was efforts in 2009, but still we have this issue with climate change. And so what are some pathways around this? And so within our own state, the EPA has come out with a series of climate change regulations. And so this is impacting our own state currently. Governor Bullock was discussing it this week and looking at what's going on with coal. And so coal is a huge topic in our own state across the region. And so basically what the EPA has said is that states like Montana are going to have to decrease their emissions by 21% by 2030. And so how are we going to do that? And so Governor Bullock said, you know what, we're able to do this. We're innovative. We're still going to be able to keep energy production, but then we can link to innovation as well with coal sequestration. And so there's ways that we can move through this. But really where policy is happening today in the U.S. is through the administrative realm or agencies. And so the EPA has been working with these industries since the 1970s. And so everyone's up in arms about the new coal regulations, but you know, we could actually take a lesson from the EPA because they've really done a concerted effort in being a consensus builder. And so they have spent a lot of time, you know, since the 70s. So they started off kind of with this us versus them mentality, but they've been working with these same groups over time and bringing people to the table and having conversations. And so sure, yes, people are still upset because change is difficult. But what they've learned, and some of the research that I've done, is that if you bring people to the table, you have conversations, or if you have one-on-one conversations, people are more willing to do something and saying, okay, yeah, this is important for the future. We need to have a long-term solution instead of short-term solutions. So I think that the EPA is really a model in building consensus instead of politicians fighting with each other, so there's a lesson there. But I think the bigger picture in terms of regulations or politics is that, you know, there are the divestment movements going on across campuses, but also internationally too. So the Norwegian states have decided to divest from coal, so Denmark and Norway, right? And so we have these different movements, and so a lot of people frame it as, you know, what's the best long-term solution for climate change? And so there's some models. But I really think the most important lesson is that consensus, but also states, local governments, universities are really the policy laboratories for the future, and we're the ones that can come up with solutions. And at the end of the day, you have to pressure lawmakers to act, you have to participate, you have to vote, because a lot of times when people are like, oh, well, who cares, I didn't vote. Well, if you don't vote, then your voice doesn't matter. I know a lot of people become frustrated that, you know, what, $10 million were spent on congressional races this year in our own state. And so how do you actually combat that, you know, the machine and following the money? But it's about, if you want something to happen, you have to increase public awareness, so conversations that we're having tonight, but also being involved. And so I think, you know, providing a policy laboratory at the state, local level, providing a model for the nation, and then that in turn pressures for lawmakers to act. And that's when action happens, when they want to, their constituents are concerned. So that's all I have for tonight. But thank you for coming, too. It's pretty awesome that everyone's here.
Right, well, I'm going to try and extract just a little bit more out of each of you with our toss-up questions. I mean, just as a sidelight, first of all, I think one thing that you are seeing modeled or exemplified in the comments so far, right, is an ability to look at the array of issues, right, rather than kind of jumping in right away with here's what ought to be done. It's here's how this complex issue of divestment intersects with a lot of different levels at the university as well as the state and nation. So let's to push on that just a little bit. Then let me pose the question as to all of the panelists: as what do you see as the potential conflicts that are surrounding the issue of divestment here on the campus? What are the cruxes of the issue? What are the possible tensions or conflicts that you might see?
Well, I think, you know, the most obvious thing is one of the spokespeople, right, for the divestment campaign is Naomi Klein, right? She wrote an essay recently on capitalism and climate, right? So the essay is kind of like, well, climate change proves that the left is right, you know? And so it's a pretty divisive essay. I mean, that's a quick summary of what she's saying, but it's a tough thing in Montana to sign on to a campaign, right, where you're identifying with a position like that, right? It's just not going to sell out there in a red state, you know, very well. So I think there is a notion that and I think it's troubling and it goes back to a larger issue of this divide where something like climate change is set up as a left-right issue. It's where you're sided with one side or the other, right? And so because of where this particular movement and the people that are championing it are so identified with one particular side, to join that movement then really creates political problems, right, for people living in a state where not everybody buys onto, we have definitely a divided state. So that's one of the problems I see is it's a very politicized issue in that way in terms of right and left. So anyway, that's a stab at it.
I guess Steve was asking about potential conflicts. So what are the potential conflicts in surrounding this and surrounding this issue as it particularly involves the University of Montana? And I don't know if I would say potential conflicts, but I might say, are there unintended messages by bringing this topic up, by having these discussions that occur? And here's what I think about. I mentioned, and I deliberately mentioned, that we have at least 174 different majors or different areas of study here just at the Missoula campus. It runs a gamut. So you have, let's take Missoula College, the two-year college here at U of M. You have our energy technology major and program there, and they work in the full array of energy systems and energy technologies. They're looking at traditional energy technologies and systems and all the way to renewable and whatever the latest is that Brad Layton can come up with. But we have students who are going into these kinds of careers, and I'm just going to mention a couple of them. Some of them are going and becoming wind technicians, or they're installing solar thermal systems. Others are becoming grid and pipeline operators, or biofuel plant operators, or geothermal technicians. So we have a program of energy technology here at the University of Montana in Missoula. We also have a highly respected and outstanding geosciences program. And our geosciences graduates, many of them, are going and working for mineral exploration companies. They're assessing groundwater contamination from abandoned reserve pits. They're working for state regulatory agencies at the state, federal levels. They're working in the petroleum industry. They're working in mining. They're working in this state. They're working in the country, and they're working globally. A year ago in the fall, I was checking into this program simply because we were, as a university and with the president, traveling to eastern Montana, Sydney, and some of those towns, and the number of undergraduate majors in geosciences as of a year ago in the fall was growing at about 10% for the last 6 years, for the previous 6 years. So unintended messages, I have not heard any conversation. I mean, what is the message about divestment and interest in divestment? What is an unintended message perhaps to someone who's majoring in one of these areas where they are planning to go into some kind of natural resource development kind of work? And I also want to remind us, because our president reminds us all the time, that we are actually part of the University of Montana system. We have affiliated universities. So we have the University of Montana Western in Dillon. We have Helena College, which is a 2-year college in our state capital. And we have Montana Tech, whose formal name is Montana Tech of the University of Montana. And of course, Montana Tech was founded as the School of Mines for the state of Montana. The mascot, I had forgotten, but the mascot is the ore diggers. And when you check into where do their graduates go, it's a highly ranked program. It is an engineering school. They call themselves the STEM University in the state of Montana. But they have about 1/3 of their graduates will work in the energy, oil, and mining industries. So So these are graduates of the University of Montana system. These are our friends and neighbors and fellow students and fellow faculty. So they have about 80 graduates who go into petroleum engineering. I was just curious about the numbers because we often don't think about that as part of the University of Montana. We have students going into mining engineering. They're going into geophysical and geological engineering. And about 2/3 of their graduates who are in what's called the environmental engineering program will wind up working in energy, oil, mining industries, and others will work on the regulatory side of that. And I think again, that becomes, Montana Tech is part of the University of Montana, so when we talk about divestment, are there intended or unintended, and I don't know the answer to this, when I think about it, it poses an interesting question, messages that we're sending to those students who are choosing those fields and who we are hoping become leaders in those areas, and to the faculty who do research and who publish, and to the universities overall. I think that's one thing where, as a and President Engstrom is the president overseeing all of these universities. We tend to link him most closely, of course, with Missoula, but ostensibly the presidents and chancellors of these other units report to him. So that to me is not a potential conflict, but an interesting juxtaposition.
Okay, I'll be brief so we can get to other questions, especially from the audience. But obviously, this is extremely political, right? And so that coming back to that us versus them. But I think that what's really interesting too, and what's kind of driving the conflict, is also a lack of awareness. So even in the U.S., there's still people that believe that climate change is not real. So that's our first problem, right? And that's where a lot of the conflict comes from. But also, too, I think it would be really interesting to actually do a poll of the entire campus, so faculty, staff, and students. Number one, to see, do people know what divestment and climate change are, right? So I'm assuming most people know what climate change is, but what about divestment? And, what are people's thoughts on the entire movement and the process, too, and getting feedback and more public engagement in the process? And so if people are more informed, then we can make better decisions. And then my final point is actually having a campus-wide conversation. And so we do, like Peggy was talking about, we have a variety of different students here. And I know in a lot of my classes, a lot of different political perspectives, which is great. I mean, that's what makes being in a college campus just so great, that you can talk about different issues from a variety of different viewpoints. But, I have a student the other day in class that was discussing, my family, I might be anti-coal, but that's the reason why I'm here, is because my dad's an engineer in the coal mines in Montana. So without that, I would not be able to come to this university without the help with my financial help of my family. So I think that we need to be cognizant of all the different voices surrounding the issue and actually having a civil conversation. So.
All right, I'm going to throw a curveball at the panel. Before I do that, however, are you writing questions? We'll collect them in a little bit. The curveball is simply, do you have questions for one another about any of the topics or ideas or comments? Yeah.
Well, we heard how Dane got roped into this panel. How did you get roped into it?
Well, they sent me an email, and I like to help students, and I was like, okay, sure, come meet with me. I was like, all right, I'll help you. You can't say no. We were all there once.
One other question that I'll pose to the group: how do we as a university balance our reputation and mission with the fiscal responsibility of providing financial support to students? And I think, in conversations with the organizing group, this was a issue that I think emerges out of the sense that, like Peggy's talking about, what are some of the unintended messages? How might divestment affect the flow of resources to either the foundation or the university as a whole? Would any of you like to take a stab at that one?
Well, I think kind of the elephant in the room is, one of our largest funders is the Washington family, right? And so they are involved with copper mining, and so, but which is interesting though is, who funds our university and provides scholarships is important. So that's how people are able to go to school. But I was reading this week too that the Rockefeller family actually decided to divest $50 billion because they see that as the future. And so I think, again, coming back to, I'm big on having conversations because I'm tired of politicians yelling at each other. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to actually have a conversation with some of our top donors and saying, what about, divestment and fossil fuels, and what are your thoughts? And having a larger campus conversation as well.
I think I'm going to stay in my larger philosophical abstractions. No, I do think, it would be a hard decision in a state like Montana, right? It would be like Stanford, I think, is one of the universities that divested, and I think it's a much easier decision there. But clearly, you would alienate a lot of people because divestment is, one of the things about divestment, it stigmatizes a particular industry. And by stigmatizing people associated with that industry, you do alienate them. So, there would be cost, right? And I think that it would be imprudent, to think about it in those terms. I think, for one thing, I do believe that one can take a strong moral stand on doing something about climate change and investing doing something about climate change without doing divestment. I don't think, it doesn't have to be that way. So I think there are, would be prudent sort of deliberations, of the kind that Sarah suggests, in saying, is this the right strategy to really invest in doing something about climate change?
I think that while the focus for divestment has been on the University of Montana Foundation and its investment of funds, we also need to be aware of how this conversation resonates across the state and across the region. We know we live in an energy-rich state, and we know that the reason that we're funded, we're a public university and we're funded by the state of Montana, and it is our elected legislators who decide every 2 years the funding for the biennium. And for the University of Montana, about I didn't write these notes I didn't write this down, but for our general operating funds, the largest proportion comes from, thanks to the students who are here, student tuition and fees. That accounts for almost 2/3 of our operating budget. The rest, it's up to 37 to 40%, comes from our allocation from the state. And the reason the state feels, and there are a number of politicians who feel this, that we have money in order to invest in education is because we're an energy-rich state. So you have interesting conversations, and it can lead, as Dane and Sarah have pointed out, to polarization or conflict, and it does drive us away from probably finding the areas where we can all agree. I'll tell a short story, because I'm a former journalist, and one of our missions really with the University of Montana webpage is we want to tell stories about the University of Montana. And stories are how we sort out the world around us and remember things. And I was thinking about this panel, and you have the walking to school, light bulb go on, or in the shower. I thought, oh yeah, it's the planetarium. So I have to share with you, a couple of weeks ago we had the Montana Board of Regents meeting here. We were the host for their 2-day meeting. And at the end of the official meeting, we offered an optional tour where we could take the regents around just to a couple of places on campus so they could really see the richness of what we offer here. We had some students, we had some faculty meet with them, and the first stop was in the Payne Family Native American Center in the Eloise Cobell Land and Culture Institute, which is on the lower level, which many of you probably know just opened in October. And the round building. Well, in the lower level, there's the round room, and that is what it's called. And it has tremendous acoustics and a microphone and four-way camera. And the rooftop for that room is domed. So it functions as a storytelling room, as a drumming room, as a great conversational area, and a planetarium. And so we had Professor Dan Reisenfeld there to operate the camera and the system to show how the planetarium portion worked. I know this is a long story, but I'll get to the point. And so he showed us if we were to see what the night sky looks like tonight in Missoula, we could go and he could show us that. But then he could take us somewhere else in the United States. He could take us over to Sydney and show us what the night sky tonight looks like there. And you know, the constellations and the stars are there slightly different. And we could move up into Canada, or we could go over to Washington, D.C. And the stars are slightly different from where we are looking at them. And it occurred to me with this very rich topic of divestment that your point of view or your understanding or your sense of where you are on this topic may differ based on where you're standing, on literally and figuratively where you come from, what your background is. It may be the opposite, the father who's in the coal industry and the student who wants to get away from that. It may be what your family's livelihood is, your background, your understandings, the kind of research you've done. And again, the challenge for us is embracing that diversity of opinion and yet figuring out what are the greater questions that we need to be wrestling with and where does that take us. That was a long way, but that's my planetarium story for the day.
Okay. All right, now I'm going to throw a curveball at the audience. I've already received several very good questions. What I would like you to do is take the next 5 minutes to talk to the person next to you. See if you can come up with another question. I believe we still have some note cards, Dove. And so if you just take 5 minutes to talk about what we've done, I'm going to go through some of the questions that we have. If you can come up with another question, I'll be happy to entertain it. Okay, great. Thank you for taking the time to have some conversation with your neighbor. I'll pose a few of these that seem to jump off that I think would provide some good jumping off points for some of the conversation that we've had so far. All right, which one do I want to start with? Well, let's start with this first one. This question asks, Bill McKibben of 350.org has said that if it's wrong to wreck the climate, then it's wrong to profit off that wreckage. And this has been one of the major arguments for the moral imperative of divestment. What do you think of this argument?
Who said that?
Can't everyone argue about morals? It's not just the forms.
It's a greater ethical moral.
All right. Yeah, I'd like to hear from you guys directly so I could look you in the eye and figure out what you're thinking. No, I think one of the problems with it is there's a positive side to that, is that it simplifies a really complex issue and helps getting people engaged. I mean, that's a powerful thing to say, right? And so when you simplify an extraordinarily complex issue, you can speak to people, right? And they can understand what you're saying and they can get engaged in the issue. Now, the flip side of course, reducing a complex issue to a simple sort of thing like that is you can end up with all kinds of errors and side effects and things can go wildly wrong. And that's what I think I referred to the issue that Amartya Sen, right, the Indian economist, philosopher that won the Nobel Peace Prize. He actually wrote an article against that kind of thinking. And he said, we need to keep it actually complex because we need to think about it in terms of development. So if you look at India with 800 million people, they want to move into a lifestyle that they can live. They can live long, healthy lives and, and a good life. It requires energy. And thinking too much on coal or too much on climate change, he says it's just one of many environmental issues, can be a mistake. And one of that is that it's forcing India into looking too much toward nuclear energy, and that's what was worrying him. So on the one hand, statements like that are great because they engage a populace that's apathetic in an important issue. On the other hand, if you stay there, you reduce this complex issue and you can end up creating problems because this is an enormously complex issue that ultimately is a development issue that engages, millions of people, billions of people that aren't in the United States, right, that are living in poverty. So that's my quick answer on that.
Go ahead, Peggy.
One of the things we were talking about up here is it's the kind of statement, and this is the kind of topic overall that can make people feel uncomfortable. And I mean, we pretty much agreed that that's probably a good thing. I mean, when you're uncomfortable about a statement or a question, or what do you really think about that, and it forces you to step back and reevaluate where you're coming from, that is seen as a good thing. When it comes to these complex issues, I had a colleague years ago in my former life as a journalist, and we used to talk about how journalists tend to oversimplify complex issues, and we become even there's even more now that it's short, it's snappy, it's quick, it's often wrong, and then how do you touch all the aspects of something, even as a responsible reporter, to cover these kinds of things. And my colleague Becky used to say, the problem for us as journalists, and I think it's even magnified, this is 10 and 20 years ago, is that we look at an issue, and this one is one. You're either for wrecking the planet or you're against it. You're either for this or you're against it. And for most of us, my friend Becky would say, we live in the mushy middle. We're not all over here, and we're not all over here on the issues. That's what pretty much you hear about, and that's what gets covered, and that's what gets the lift-out quote or the pull quote or the tweet. But most of us live in that mushy middle, and it depends. And it might depend. It might be situational. It might mean, well, we like that, but we don't want more nuclear power, or So that's the part that's hard, and it's good to go where things are difficult.
You good?
All right. Yeah, this is great. All right, the mushy middle. Here's a question. Naomi Klein, come back to something Dana's mentioned, has claimed recently that one of the major problems with our current system's inability to respond in a timely and urgent way to climate change is what she calls fetishizing centrism. Not stirring the pot too much, avoiding alienating people. Now, if we can agree that an urgent response is in fact needed, but an educational institution can't even reposition funding towards cleaner energy sources, how do we respond to the possibility that we might just stick it out in this incremental safety zone all the way to a quick evolutionary and something for our species?
I don't know. Didn't you bring up Naomi Klein?
I didn't. So what was the fetishism again? Centrism, fetishistic centrism.
Fetishizing centrism.
The middle.
That's great.
No, you don't have to.
That is great. I don't know. And that I think that's the frustration with a lot of things in the world. I mean, you mentioned that the last major piece of environmental legislation in the 1990s. I mean, we're still talking about de-evolution, if you will, the change in mission, the broadened mission of what used to be the School of Forestry. And in the 1970s, there was a report that really came down on maybe we needed to look at harvesting the forest, and there were other values that we had in those forests. And that, believe it or not, that was 1970. That's still a discussion today. Not as intense, but it's still a discussion. So things move slowly in the world, and universities are remember, when you go through graduation, you will wear regalia that goes back to the Middle Ages, so it takes a long time.
Also in the U.S., so incrementalism is how we make policy. I mean, I know people want things to happen overnight, but unfortunately it doesn't. And especially when it comes to environmental policy, in the U.S., we are reactive and not proactive. So the question becomes, when Arizona runs out of water, or other issues too, what are we going to do? And so I think that, yes, it's great to kind of pressure people to act, but usually coming back to that comfortability, people are comfortable in the middle and they don't want to be on the fringes. So.
Go ahead, Dane. Okay. As a follow-up to, were you wanting to chime in?
Well, I bet somebody asked it because of what I said.
There are two questions that are related. One comes from Robin Saha, and another one was anonymous. One person posed the question this way: if the future of energy production, both in Montana and globally, is in some form of renewables, wouldn't it make some sense for the foundation to hedge its bets in the renewable direction? And as Robin puts it, can we get away from all or nothing thinking? Could divest from some fossil fuels without hurting Montana businesses and jobs and see benefits coming to instead of fully divesting?
Okay, the answer according to Professor Saha is yes. I mean, that's a question for the foundation, so I don't know that any one of us can answer that. Interesting question, and I think it's one that foundations are wrestling with, and you know, it's like, that's a great question, unable to answer it. I'm sorry.
Well, it's interesting too, though, because wind generation increased, what, 30% last year? So it's 6% of our electricity in the state, so it's increasing.
I guess what if I could chime in.
Yes, please.
My frustration is that there's sort of this fear that somehow those people at Montana Tech that have these jobs, or that the parent is not going to be able to send their kid to school, and I just don't know if that's real. And you know, are the investments that has in Montana itself, and how much would really shifting those hurt people in Montana? And I think we really need to think about this kind of rationally a lot of it, you know, instead of just emotionally. And what are the real numbers, and where are these investments, and what difference would it really make? And I think that policymakers and decision makers and everybody needs to sort of get that all out on the table.
Okay. Here's from a slightly different angle. As major universities across America are starting to divest, do we risk being overlooked by prospective students who are increasingly concerned with the green profile of their college choice?
Well, I mean, we have what? Nikki, you can correct me. Don't we have the first ever climate studies minor in the nation, right? So, I mean, I think we do some pretty impressive things on campus that other schools don't. So I don't think we're going to be overshadowed because of efforts that have been done, so.
Here's a question from Phil Condon. To whom does the money that the UMF manages belong? That's a good factual question, Phil. Well done.
Well, I meant it fairly rhetorically, although I don't really know the answer. But I mean, in all these conversations, we hear the absolute truth. The foundation and the university are two separate entities. And I'm sure legally and financially there's good reason for that. At the same time, it's a question that at least on a common sense level, I think is important. And if I can too, Steve, can I have my comment there? Yeah. I also just wanted to add to the conversation. I was chair of the Sustainable Campus Committee in 2007 when President Denison signed on to the American College President's Climate Committee, and was involved in the first two reports there. And university investments were 7 years ago part of that commitment. One of the major areas, along with about 8 areas: transportation, purchasing policy, all sorts of things for each university to look at and report back on. So I agree that, and I'm really glad to see the renewed vigor in the discussion, but that was identified in the commitment we signed on to as one of the areas where we, in reporting, that we should look at, and that all the signatories should look at. But that doesn't answer my question. If anybody can answer that, to whom does the money belong? I don't know.
Go ahead. As a matter of fact, the UN Foundation is not separate from the university. The university and the foundation claim that it is, but look at the foundation's website. Look at the contract between the university and the foundation. They say that the foundation is the official development, that is fundraising and investment, office of the University of Montana. How can an official office of the University of Montana a public institution in the state of Montana be a private, separate institution. It's a scam. The foundation business model that is so beloved around the country is a scam that has been designed to circumvent popular sovereignty and public accountability. The university pays the foundation to raise money and invest it, and then claims that the university has no right to decide how the money is to be invested. And that is a scandal.
No response. These are two very different questions, but I think there is a connection between them. One comes from George Price, and he asked primarily to Dane. Am I correct in that you're suggesting that the divestment movement is too divisive in Montana or in any red state? Historically, there were a considerable number of abolitionists and Underground Railroad activists in the South in that era before the Civil War, and some of them went to jail for their public and covert acts against slavery. Were they acting wrongly or ineffectively? And then from a somewhat different angle, J.P. Kemick asked, and I think both of these questions get to, what is the basis for possible divestment. With the idea of the issue of divestment being a left versus right, us versus them, red versus blue issue, isn't that simply an issue of framing for the UM community? That we could frame this debate in a way that might appeal to a more conservative, extraction-based community and economy? So, either of those entice you?
They said it was directed at me. Who said
Yeah,
that?
they did.
But they said, am I correct in assuming? Well, maybe not. I don't know. Well, one of the things is the analogy with abolition, right? And is that the correct analogy? Is that what we're looking at here? And I think so. You could ask, is slavery everywhere and always an evil, right? And I think we could answer yes. And so I think that the sort of moralizing that issue seems to be unproblematic to me, and I think to everybody. But on the other hand, as we were talking here earlier, is sort of the burning of fossil fuel for energy so unproblematically, immoral, if you would. And I think that the analogy may not hold, and I'll just throw this out here for conversation. In the sense that, let's say if you put a coal fire plant in India and you provide electricity to a couple of million people, you've done them good, right? You have probably helped their human rights to some degree. Now, and so it's much more muddled than that. So I think that it's a much more complex issue. And I also think the thing that troubled me about that I mentioned before, and like I said, I think there's many, many good things about the divestment campaign, and I think it's a great strategy for engaging students. But I am worried a little bit about it as a strategy in the sense that it stigmatizes, just about everybody that uses fossil fuels. In the sense that when I was going to be on this panel, I went to TIAA-CREF, and I go, God, is TIAA-CREF divested from fossil fuels? And the answer was no, right? And so my, retirements, now they are careful. I invest in the social choice account, try to do my best, but they've made a decision to be selective about the energy companies that they invest in, but they haven't made that stand. So there is a notion of stigmatizing a group of people in an industry that that right now, initially, looking at this for the first time a couple weeks ago, that has made me a little uncomfortable.
George or JP, did you want to follow up with your questions at all? George, I know where George is. I don't know who JP is. Oh, okay. Do either of you want to follow up on your questions? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I guess my question was just that it seems like you referenced Naomi Klein as somebody we don't necessarily in Montana think of aligning ourselves with, and that could hamper efforts.
Many people in Montana.
Sure, yeah, and I understand that, but I feel like the way to work in any given community is to frame the debate so that it is persuasive in that community. And so when I hear that we don't want to align ourselves with the left, well, why do we have to say that this is a leftist campaign, and can't we say that it is a Montana campaign in the way that we would frame any other debate here?
And I think that's great. So everything you said I agree with, right? It's just that the way the campaign has developed, right, there is a de facto identification, right? And so, yeah, I would think, yeah, if the way you articulate it sounds great to me.
I will pose one more question, then we'll have, we may have just a few more possibilities for just an open mic for a couple of minutes. Here's one factual question I think we all need to figure out. How much money would be affected if divested? What is the amount of money tied up in fossil fuels? What would be the amount of money lost from moving to a more green portfolio? And is there a risk if we don't divest?
You're closer to being an economist.
I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but there has been studies that have shown that the long-term risk is actually higher if we don't divest. I mean, that's the stuff that I have read in terms of studies by economists. And that's why you're seeing a lot of internationally, you've seen, like I said, a lot of Norwegian states that have decided to divest specifically from coal. And you actually have a lot of neighboring states, too, that no longer want to have electricity from coal either, just because of the pollution. So I don't know the exact numbers. I'm not an economist. I study public policy, so, but.
Yeah, I think I tried to answer that by saying we don't know those numbers. I think that very much fits in with the questions you had, and I think those are good questions, and we don't have that information. So,
do we have? Would someone like to pose yet one more question? Caitlin, you were raising your hand.
I was going to respond to the question about how much we have invested in fossil
Thank you.
So I'm part of Reinvest Montana, and we've done research around this. It's estimated that we have $7 to $12 million invested in the fossil fuel industry, and that number hasn't been contested by the foundation. And we don't have a list of all of the fossil fuel companies, and I don't know how many of them are on the top 200 list, which is ordered by carbon reserves. But I do know that our top fossil fuel investments are in ExxonMobil and Gazprom, which is a Russian natural gas company, and both of those are on that list.
Great, thank you. Perhaps one more question? Go ahead. Here, I can bring you the mic.
In terms of how Peggy Kerr began talking about diversity as one of the goals of the university, and something that Dane said about catastrophic rhetoric and the kinds of things it leads to, those two things taken together make me think about how even in a conversation like this, the tribes in Montana don't enter the conversation. And if I'm a person, I'm in Kate Shanley in Native American Studies, I'm a person who's always looking for the paradigm shift. And if change only comes incrementally, many of us are already feeling the sense of catastrophe coming, because we can, in this issue, take catastrophic we can't take incremental change at this point. I mean, it feels that way. But we also don't want to reproduce the kinds of majority rules, money speaks, and so on, that has been the paternalistic policy governing indigenous people and their lands forever. And so how do we get indigenous people at the table and really shift the paradigm, not just simply look at, and I really appreciated the remarks about the the foundation not being separate for the but that's how power networks itself. But if you could genuinely get other voices at the table, is there a way to shift this paradigm so we stop looking at just increments and stop reproducing the kinds of policies that truly decimate populations, like the tar sands? That may not be a significant number of human beings affected by the tar sands, but it is it is morally and ethically very significant.
Any response to that, Matt? Okay, thank you for that comment. Well, we've reached 6:30, which was our ending point. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for participating with us tonight. And thank you very much for your questions. I thought it was an excellent way of getting beneath the surface of this issue to some of the complexities and depth that it has. So thank you very much, and we encourage you to keep engaged with this issue.